Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, conference. Last June, I visited the US Federal Supermax prison in Colorado, and there was one thing that impressed me above all. Of course, the United States federal officials that I spoke to wanted to promote their way to an international visitor like me. And of course, their regime is not foolproof. I found that even in the deepest forms of custody, attacks on correctional officers can and did happen. And true, there is a risk that exceptionally restrictive measures at a supermax can be used against terrorists who are too old and too frail to present a realistic physical threat. In other words, there is a risk that these measures can be used for the symbolic rather than for legitimate protection. But what impressed me so much from that visit was what I will call confidence in control. The warden, the number one governor, the warden of the entire correctional institution, and bear in mind the Supermax prison was part of an enormous complex with the equivalents of Cat B, Cat A, and various step-up and step-down facilities. She had her office in the Supermax unit itself, and that is where prisoners like Abu Hamza are still held. That is where the risk lay, and that is where the warden, and I think probably she is the most important governor in the entire US federal penitentiary system. That is where she physically was on a day-to-day basis. She was clearly in charge, and her staff were confident in control. She felt, and it was obvious when I spoke with her, she felt supported by senior management within the Federal Bureau of Prisons, many of whom had done the same job before her. The correctional officers, the prison officers, were able to have frank and meaningful conversations with their prisoners because they felt in control. They were able to say, if you behave, things will get better for you. If you don't behave, things will become more restrictive for you, and they meant it, and it happened. The prison's own lawyers, if you can believe it, so responsible for drafting the tricky witness statements to try and explain to a judge just how difficult it is to manage certain prisoners, those lawyers were themselves correctional officers. They knew. And this sense of confidence in control influenced my recommendations on the single separation centre system, which I did after my review following the atrocious attack by Hashim Abedi at Frankland. And I've seen the bravery too. I know some of you are here today, and it was very good to meet some of you last year. But I regret to say that I did not find that separation centre prison officers, even the governor of the separation centre unit itself, that they really felt they had the control that they deserved. And in my view, it is necessary to strip away some of the bureaucracy that left individual prison officers feeling completely at sea about how they could manage some of these dangerous individuals. I mean, some of the stories were quite hair-raising. Literally, prison officers being confronted by prisoners who were saying, "We are an army. We are an army." Let me give you an example, and this is one that I can't forget. Officers I spoke to considered, based on the advice that they were getting, that they were simply unable to remove the aluminium ring pulls from the cans that the prisoners had been drinking from, even though those same metal ring pulls could be used to fashion weapons, because this would breach a principle of equality derived from the wording of the prison rules. They were also advised that it was difficult to use empty segregation cells. There were special segregation cells within the separation centre system, even where the officers had been threatened in the way that I've just described, unless the very same conduct would result in segregation in mainstream, where, of course, there is much greater pressure on segregation cells, and therefore the threshold of behaviour that might lead you to go into one of them was higher. This seemed to be wrong. Now, I hope my recommendations will strip away inappropriate bureaucracy, and the principles in my review will give officers greater confidence in control. But of course, a recommendation is nothing without implementation. I'm pleased the government has accepted all the recommendations in my report, and I hope that they are implemented swiftly. Let me say a little bit more now about terrorism in prisons more generally. Now, I've written 3 reports, actually, that have had something to do with terrorist prisoners. I did a report on released terrorist prisoners who are managed under a multi-agency system called MAPA. I did one on terrorism in prisons generally in 2022, and then my separation centres report. I think it's right to say that whilst I've been in positions 2019, the most important legal changes have been to do with the management of prisoners on release. We are talking, aren't we, about the management of prisoners when they are actually in custody. I do get it that amongst all the other risks of violence and the demands that you have, like getting prisoners to court on time or stopping drugs or illicit phones, terrorism in prison can almost feel a little bit remote. When I did my first report, I've heard that some manifestations of terrorism were almost welcomed by the system. And I'm thinking of the Wing Emir, that is the leader of the local Islamist gang who could keep a lid on disorder. But I concluded that this sort of radicalizing influence could, in the long run, prove fatal. In prison, and I think in particular of the 2020 attack in HMP Whitemoor, where a terrorist offender and a radicalized prisoner called Baz Hockton almost killed a prison officer. And then, of course, on their release in the community. And there was that terrible sequence of attacks by prisoners at Fishmongers Hall, Streatham and Reading, where they all behaved in a way in prison which was an absolute warning signal about what they intended to do when they were released. What this meant in practice was that even if a prisoner joined an Islamist gang with motives simply of self-protection, without really buying into the whole creed, there was still a counter-terrorism aspect. And this required, as I concluded, a sensitivity to terrorist risk behaviour. An awareness, for example, that when the news comes on and there's a terrorist attack, if there are prisoners on the wing clapping and cheering and celebrating, that is a warning sign that has to be dealt with. Now, I recognise that this could seem like special pleading by a counter-terrorism specialist, and I recognise that sometimes counter-terrorism sucks resources away from the rest of the system which needs it. The way in which I put it was this: where there is an attack by a terrorist in prison, firstly, there is a loss of public confidence in the authorities, a sense that society cannot neutralise or contain the threat that's posed by terrorists even after they've gone to prison. In other words, the appearance that terrorists have been allowed to carry on their campaign against the state or the public, and crucially, by targeting prison officers as the representatives of the state that they cannot get at otherwise. Secondly, there is the frustration of the expectations of victims and the survivors and their families that convicted terrorists should never again be allowed to use violence. It amounts, in effect, to a subversion of the criminal justice outcome. Thirdly, there's the real prospect of a radicalising effect within the wider prison estate. An attack by a notorious prisoner can be seen as a sort of symbolic victory against the establishment, to advance the terrorist cause through the propaganda of the deed, or simply inspire copycat attacks. And fourthly, there are the additional burdens arising from such an attack: the fear of existing and future staff that they will be victims, on unconnected prisoners who may quite unfairly find their privileges downgraded, or the public purse because of internal reviews, police investigations or reforms. So given these consequences, my conclusion is that there is a dignity in containment as a goal alongside the importance of rehabilitation. So what are the key points that have emerged in my various reviews? Well, I've mentioned the importance of identifying and not ignoring terrorist risk behaviour. There is the importance of intelligence that's genuinely actionable. I've seen far too many cases where huge amounts of intelligence are generated but not acted upon. There's the need to recognize where the power lies within the prison system. Now, if you're on license, the people with the power are probation. If the offender is in custody, the power lies with the number one governor. It's no good if responsibility for counter-terrorism is delegated entirely to specialists. It has to be the number one governor who is responsible for terrorist risk offenders in his prison. He or she has got the power to prioritize counter-terrorism or not. And finally, I think we all understand now that risk does not end at the point of sentence. Some terrorist offenders will carry on committing terrorist offences in prison. If so, those offences, in other words, criminal conduct, cannot simply be dealt with as disciplinary matters to be brushed under the carpet. They must be identified and prosecuted as part of the ongoing process of managing risk. Now, so far, I've only talked about prisons and prison officers, but I know this is an association for workers in other secure settings, so let me expand a little bit. Some of the occasionally catastrophic violence carried out by psychiatric patients will be terrorism or terrorist-inspired. In fact, in my report on multi-agency arrangements, I wrote a whole annex on terrorist risk offenders who've been admitted to hospital under the Mental Health Act. I made the point that no institution is an island, that information has to be shared, that judgments are really difficult. This person who's talking about carrying out an attack, is that just paranoid delusion? Or are they actually a terrorist about to, telling me that they're about to carry out an attack? And also that responsibility for dangerous mental health prisoners cannot be allowed to fall between the gaps of the health service, police, and others. Immigration detention. That too will almost certainly be affected. Let us say hypothetically that under this government or a future government, there is much greater use of immigration detention of, say, small boat arrivals, and that some of those who are detained will be detained for a long period of time while arrangements are made for their removal to places where historically they have not been removed. Let us say that is hypothetically the case. I do not see why immigration detention of that sort will be immune from these considerations. A small number of immigration detainees may have arrived in the UK wishing us harm. Some may adopt Islamist or terrorist personas in detention for the familiar reasons that we know. Some will be influential. And in fact, we've already had experience of that in the UK when, after 9/11, the UK detained Abu Qatada, who was extremely influential, extremely dangerous within the system. The position is different, I think, in the UK and America. I welcome correction, but I think, if I'm right, the terrorist risk within our population is Islamist. Very different in the correctional facility in Colorado, where I began my address. I recall it was almost like the Shawshank Redemption, walking around the sort of perimeters of a huge yard, several football pitches wide. There were the prisoners with their tops off, playing basketball in the sun. It was all calm because the correctional officers had been able to distinguish the tattoos that marked the Mexican gangs from the Californian gangs. If they made a mistake, there would be, no question about it, immediate killing. A failure to separate one gang from the other could, in other words, be fatal. And in the US, of course, it's not just Islamist terrorists, but also extreme right-wing prisoners who have influence. I haven't yet, if I'm candid, seen extreme right-wing terrorist influence within the prison system, but it must be possible. Perhaps, and I'm thinking about the people who are convicted on the extreme right wing, often very isolated, younger, lone actors, often neurodiverse, often they come at it through the internet. I don't know whether they are going to create an influence within the prison system. I think that there are perhaps more important future risks. First of all, in the last few years, the UK has got the bit between its teeth in taking action against state threat actors. So the new National Security Act has been used much more than was anticipated to deal with Russian proxies Iranian saboteurs, and recently against Chinese intelligence activity. This means there will now be an entry into the prison system of a new type of risk. And I should say that these risks are quite different. The risk presented by a teenager who's willing to burn down a synagogue for money or a warehouse for money is going to be very different from a middle-aged man who's using technical means to survey NATO troops who are practicing in the UK. So there'll be different sorts of risk to manage. It's of course possible that some of these individuals will try and foment chaos in the system to pursue their state threat goals. I think it's perhaps more likely that some of these people who carry out state threat activity are wannabe James Bonds, and they will gravitate towards the more influential figures on the wing. Secondly, there is the threat of prisoners who are not just prepared to use ever greater violence within the custodial setting, but appear to be attracted to or even fixated by violence. These are your Axel Rudicabanas and people like that. Now, from the point of view of a prison officer who's been assaulted, it may not matter, of course, whether they are a terrorist prisoner or not, but we have to reckon that there are now people in our system who love violence. We need to learn the right lessons. Some of these violent individuals who come into the prison system will in truth only have been fantasizing, and they may not present a risk. Some of them will present to you an extreme risk. And I hope that the recommendations that I've made about terrorist risk prisoners may have some relevance as well to those violent obsessives who you may unfortunately have to deal with. I want to end my address with some personal reflections. I have come to appreciate that what prison officers do is more central to how our society operates than I ever imagined. I'm just a lawyer. Law and order is, if you like, the original rule of law, and without that, society cannot function. And law and order don't function without the ability to detain individuals on remand and to implement prison sentences passed by judges, hopefully, but not always, with a view to moving them on to better and more useful lives. I spend a lot of time with senior counter-terrorism police officers, MI5, officials in the Home Office. They will look at an arrest of a dangerous terrorist. And we all know the sorts of plots that have been happening recently. An undercover officer going on to stop a mass casualty attack at extraordinary risk. And they will rightly come out in front of the cameras and say, we've stopped this, and they will take credit for it, rightly. But they cannot really congratulate themselves on putting a stop to the risk presented by a serious terrorist offender unless they can be confident there is a prison system that is able to hold that person. And victims of terrorism cannot have any confidence that at least there will be no further attacks from that individual if you cannot be given the confidence to control the risk that they present. I've tried in my various reports to throw a little light on what you do. I have to say, I have found working on terrorism in prisons the most difficult of all the tasks I've ever done. I have found it compelling, and I'm saying this sincerely. It's not just an attempt to butter you up. I have found speaking to you and listening to you and reflecting on your experience and your expertise amazing. I have come to respect your role very deeply indeed. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It is appreciated. And the people in front of you will tell you exactly what's gone wrong in separation centres. When they were first opened, staff had authority, they were professional, they were empowered, they were overruled by senior leaders, they were undermined, There is an obsession, and there is an obsession throughout the entire prison estate, not just separation centres, for senior leaders to appease prisoners. Senior leaders in this service are absolutely terrified of upsetting prisoners. And I know you've recognised that yourself. So we will not allow it as a union. Our members will not allow it as a union for your recommendations to be watered down by the government to save costs, or watered down by senior leaders in an effort to appease prisoners because they don't like the strict regimes we're about to impose upon them. We will not allow that. I can't thank you enough for your report and your support, and you are welcome back at POA conference whenever you like.